Hello and welcome to the Indy Author Podcast. Today, my guest is John Gaspard. Hey, John, how are you doing?
I'm very happy to be back.
Yes, you have been a multiple time guest, and I'm going to be going over what some of the previous topics have been that we discussed. But just in case anyone needs a little reminder about who you are, John Gaspard is the author of the Eli Marks Mystery Series, the Como Lake Players Mystery Series, and several standalone novels. He also hosts Behind the Page, the Eli Marks Podcast, and John has directed 6 low-budget features that cost very little and made even less, and has written multiple books on the subject of low-budget filmmaking. And in fact, we have tapped into that expertise in a couple of previous episodes. Back in 180, we talked about the top 6 lessons novelists can learn from movies. Way back in 128, we talked about lessons from filmmaking for the Indy Author. And then we also talked about speech to text and back again. So we covered a couple of topics there related and not related to film. And if anyone wants to find us, they can go to the indyauthor.com/episodes-all and search for John Gaspard's name, find those. And so we are going to be talking today about something that's also kind of movie related. And we're going to be talking about from research to book, and specifically about your book, Held Over, Harold and Maude at the Westgate Theater. And so I wanted to start right out asking you, what was your inspiration to write Held Over, Harold and Maude at the Westgate Theater?
Well, I've always been a fan of the movie Harold and Maude. I don't know, Maddie, if you've seen it.
Not for many, many years.
Many, many years. Well, Harold and Maude played at one theater here in Minneapolis for over 2 years, from 1972 into 1974. Just when I was in 9th, 10th, 11th grade, an impressionable age. And I have a lot connected with that movie. I worked at the movie theater after that movie left. I was involved with anniversaries. I'm just very tied up in it. And I have, as you mentioned, a podcast about my books, but I also have what's called the Occasional Film Podcast, which is literally occasionally. I don't know if I've done one for a few months, but I did interview a guy named James Davidson who'd written a book called Hal Ashby and the Making of Harold and Maude, which was a very detailed book about the entire process of getting that movie made in 1970, 71. And after I posted that, I got a little text from my older brother, and he just said, "You should have written that book," because he felt that I knew as much or more than the author. I didn't know more, but I certainly knew a lot down some rabbit holes that the author had not gone down. But I didn't want to ever write that book. But I did want to do something about Harold and Maude, and it occurred to me that I was here for that very pivotal 2-year period where it became a cult film. And it may well not have become a cult film if it didn't live at the Westgate Theater for 2 years. So I thought, all right, I will explore that and see what that becomes. At the same time, I, like many people, I'm sure you too, have Joanna Penn's voice in the back of my head saying, make a beautiful book. You should make a beautiful book. And I thought this is the opportunity to do that, do something that only I can write, really, because I was here and I know all the details. And it'd be a book that I would love to see if I hadn't written it, which I think is the key. With everything I've written, I think I'm the primary audience, but there are other people who are interested. With this one, I really thought there's just 3 people who will be interested, and I'm one of them. So I thought I'm just going to dig in and see what will this book become, and let it become what it became. And that was, about 9 months of research that became that book. So that's where it came from.
And I already have lots of questions. So can you give a little more context about the cult status of the movie? Was it specifically the movie plus the Westgate Theater that was cult? Was this like a cult experience beyond that area? And the reason I'm asking this is I'm eventually at the end of our conversation going to lead into who's the audience for this beyond yourself and the 2 other people that you knew. Yes. Like, is it the people who are in your area, or is it more generally about the movie?
I'll answer that first because that'll help. There is an audience out there for Harold and Maude material because it was for 2 years at one theater in Minneapolis. It had essentially died at the end of 1971. It was released in December and was gone 2 weeks later. And back at that time, when a movie went away, it really went away. It might show up on TV, it might, but there was no VHS, there was no streaming, there was no nothing. So movies really did go away. And the reason it died is it was a Paramount movie, and Paramount had booked tons of theaters all over the country to show The Godfather. It was their Christmas movie of 1971. And it turned out The Godfather wasn't ready. It wasn't done. And so they said to the theater owners, we're going to give you Harold and Maude instead, with a terrible marketing campaign. Nobody knew who was in it or what it was about. And they dumped it in a lot of theaters at once. They dumped it into the Godfather theaters, where it would have been a hit if it had been the Godfather, but it wasn't. So it disappeared quite quickly. However, the Westgate Theater, which is right on the edge of Minneapolis into a suburb called Edina, had gotten kind of a reputation for long runs of odd comedies. The 12 Chairs that Mel Brooks had made ran there for a dozen weeks, which is a long time, longer than anything had ever run at the Westgate. And Where's Papa had run for 36 weeks. And so the booker who booked the Westgate along with other theaters decided they would try Harold and Maude. And it was a hit right away, because there was a local columnist who wrote a big, long column right before it opened saying, you should see this movie. He was actually saying you should see the short that comes before this movie, but you might as well stay and see this movie. And they were selling out immediately. And then it kept holding on and holding on and holding on and holding on. And other theater owners around the country saw this and tried to replicate it. And in many cases did. It ran for a long time in Detroit. It ran for a long time in Toronto. It ran for a couple of years in Paris. But that wouldn't have happened if there hadn't been this reputation that was built up of Harold and Maude again and again at the Westgate. As soon as Harold and Maude left the Westgate, the theater became yet another single-screen neighborhood theater, which were dying at that point because of multiplexes. And it did, in fact, close a couple of years later. So it was a perfect confluence of an odd movie in a theater that was known for odd movies. And the audience just kept coming back and coming back and coming back.
Although we want to focus on Harold and Maude at the Westgate Theater, that story you told about them creating this cult classic in a circumstance that wasn't planned, because this is what showed up instead of The Godfather. There's some potentially interesting lessons there for indie authors, like stepping into an unmet need or something like that.
Yes. The biggest lesson I think an indie author would take away from Harold and Maude was said by one of the executives at Paramount after a preview, because the movie previewed really, really well. Audiences loved it. And he said, this is a great movie and we're the wrong company to market it, because they were a very staid, Paramount had been around since the 1910s probably. They weren't used to this kind of movie and didn't know how to deal with it. And as authors, we need to understand when we're marketing something, who is that audience? They didn't know who their audience was. What is the movie? They didn't know what the movie was, and they never found a way to bring those things together until around 1981. They did a new campaign, which was a little closer to it. But by that point, it was already a cult hit. So I think any campaign would have done well at that point. But this was a case where the people who were supposed to market it simply did not understand what it was they had or who would be interested in it.
Yeah, that seems like there's a very close analogy there with traditional publishers, where they have a whole machine set up.
And if it doesn't fit the machine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you decided that you were going to write a book, but did you ever, in the process of thinking about this topic, decide that you might want to address it as a movie?
That actually never even entered my consciousness. Part of that might be because, for years and years, I made low budget movies. And then as I got older and that was harder to do, I switched to novel writing, and now I write novels and I do books. And that's sort of my mindset now. It had not occurred to me to do that. And I'm not sure that I would have had enough material to do that, because so many of the key people are gone. I was able to piece together a lot from existing print interviews. But unlike a cult movie like Rocky Horror Picture Show, which was covered very well, and they did all kinds of interviews with all the participants over the years because it was such an odd cult film that had, very dramatic following. There would have been a lot of material there. In fact, I think that the creator's son, Richard O'Brien's son, isn't doing a documentary, in fact, on that, because there is a lot of material. With Harold and Maude, there would not have been that amount of stuff. So no, it was always going to be, I knew I wanted to do a book, and then I thought about it more, and I knew I wanted to do a book about how it became a cult film at that theater. And then that grew into, it's that, but it's also sort of looking at the death of the single screen neighborhood theater, because that had Harold and Maude not been a hit at that theater, I think it would have closed long before it did.
You had said a couple of times that you were your own audience. If you're making an avatar, like what characteristics do you have that you would want to appeal to for other readers?
Well, this is a question that I'm sure you've asked yourself a lot when you're writing your own books, is who is my intended audience? And I always write for me first. I'm the one who would enjoy reading about Eli Marks, the magician detective. I'm the one who'd find a book on filmmaking interesting. I'm the one who would like to take classic books and have them rewritten from the point of view of a greyhound. That's me. And if other people like it, that's fine. And I'm able to do that because I'm not trying to make a living writing books. I'm just trying to write books that I enjoy, that I hope other people will. And this is the ultimate of that. As I said, in starting the research for it, I could name 3 people who'd want to read it. One would be me. One would be one of the guys I talked to, a guy named Randy Green, who was the assistant manager at the theater at that time. And the third person was Nancy Saslow, who is the granddaughter of the guy who created the theater. I knew the 3 of us would love to read this book, and I'm guessing other Harold and Maude fans will want to read it. I did a little Kickstarter on it and got a lot of positive response from people who are really looking forward to seeing the book and are big fans of the movie. And then there's a subset of that, which are people who are interested in old movie theaters. But again, it comes down to, I did it because I wanted it. It's a book I wanted to have. And if other people want it, that's great, but I'm not doing it for them.
And it's obvious that you had a lot of material to begin with, but not enough for an entire book on this subject. So talk a little bit about your research process, where you looked, how you looked.
Sure.
How you sorted through that.
Yeah, it's funny because one of the most pivotal moments in the history of the movie at that theater was the 2nd-year anniversary, where the 2 stars came and spoke to the audience. And I followed them around with my Super 8 camera and got lovely footage of them, and got to hang out with Ruth Gordon, got to have dinner with Bud Cort. I mean, that 2-year thing is pivotal for me, but also if you type in Harold and Maude's 2-year anniversary into Google, there's a picture that's going to show up of the front of the theater with a bunch of people holding picket signs, and the signs say, "We want a new movie, Harold and Maude go away." And there's maybe 20 protesters out there or more, all with picket signs. And I was able to track down the husband of the woman who organized that event and was talking to him about it over the phone. And he said, "I don't understand. You're doing a book about this. How could you do a book about that one evening?" And I said, it's not going to be that. It's going to have to be everything about the theater and everything about Harold and Maude. I mean, not everything, but in order for it to work, I've got to go back to the beginning. Where did this theater come from? Why is there this beautiful, well, at the time, beautiful jewel box theater in the middle of a Minneapolis suburb that has another beautiful theater already built 6 blocks away? And this is being built in the Depression. Where did that come from? And how did that theater become the worn out shell of the theater that I worked at in 1975 and 1976? How did that happen? And then at the same time, you're telling the parallel story of how did Harold and Maude happen? And then they converge for those 2 years. And then the second half of the book is what happened to Harold and Maude after that, because it had probably more history after that than it had before. And what happened to the theater after that? So what was a very simple idea was like, what was that 2 years about? Grew into a history of the theater and a history of the movie and the history of how they both helped each other and then went their separate ways.
Did you know going in that those were going to be your guide rails, or is that something that developed as you collected material?
It really all developed from one thing popping up, which led to another thing, which led to another thing. Like I said, I worked at the theater for a couple of years after Harold and Maude had been there. So I knew the building, but I had questions about the building because it's an odd building, and it has a hairdressing salon on one side of it that appears to be part of the building, and it has a tiny little library on the other side that appears to be part of the building, but neither one of them are. And so I just started doing research on, okay, this building came into existence in 1935. Why? And you go to the historical societies here in town. There's several of them because of Some are in St. Paul, some in Minneapolis, some in the suburb of Edina. And you find out that there was this violinist for the Minneapolis Orchestra who couldn't make a living as a violinist, even though he was apparently something of a prodigy. So he went into the insurance business and in 1934 decided, I want to build a movie theater that I can show movies at and I can have my orchestra play. And he built this little jewel box theater that opened in 1935, middle of the Depression. And then he found out immediately he couldn't get first-run movies. He could only get second and third-run movies. And that's what the theater became for the next 40 years. But then he died a year later. So the guy, the visionary, is dead. What happens to the theater? So you just, I'm reading newspaper accounts. As luck would have it, the daughter of the founder did write a memoir that was never published, but one of the historical sites said everything led to something else, which led to something else, which led to something else. And, every question I had, for the most part, I was able to find answers to if you're willing to sit down and go through newspapers.com and read every year what's going on with the word Westgate. And that's what happened. I was able to create an entire timeline for the theater and then started digging into the movie. I already knew some stuff there, but there was stuff I wanted to have surprises, and there were several surprising things I found there. So it's just a question of immersing yourself in the research and not always knowing what you're going to get, but being willing to sit there and scan through whatever you're scanning through in the hopes that something great will pop up. And in most cases, it did. There was always something exciting that I found.
It's interesting how any one of those components could be a book unto itself. Like I can imagine a book called The Westgate Theater, and it would be very interesting to just say from its first day to its last day, what was going on at the Westgate Theater that was reflective of like what was going on in the rest of the country or what was going on in the rest of the world or what that said about the economics of the time or whatever. Were you always very comfortable with the Westgate Theater plus Harold and Maude angle?
Yes. I didn't realize I'd have as much history about the theater as I did, but I kept having questions about the layout of the building. And that's, we're fortunate that the architectural company that did it donated all of their files to an architectural historical museum, which is part of the University of Minnesota. So with some emails and phone calls back and forth, I'm able to go in and they've laid out on a table for me the blueprints for the building, the original sketch for what it was supposed to be, the version of it that held 1,000 people instead of 500 people. All those answers kept bubbling up if I was willing to take the time and dig in. It was fascinating because if this guy, Carl Fust, hadn't decided to create a theater and then died a year later, it's entirely possible that although Harold and Maude would be a heralded film today, I'm not sure would have had quite the cult status or would have gotten there the way it did, because it was the right theater with the right film at the right time. And it's just fascinating to see how that happened and how the theater tried to survive all those years to get to that point, and at the same time, what the filmmakers were doing to try to make the thing they were making and what they were up against. And then they all come together for this 2 years of sold out shows.
So once you had done all this research, visited all these historical societies and so on, you had big loads of information. Can you just describe the actual logistics? Like, were these physical artifacts that you were arranging on a desk? Was it all electronic? Describe that a little bit.
It was all electronic. Yeah, I don't think I had any. I personally owned a couple posters from the film and a couple of autographed pictures of it. And then I had the Super 8 footage that I'd shot, which I had already digitized it. I was able to grab frames from that and enhance the frames so they look a little bit nicer. So I had all those visuals. I had very little on the theater itself and was able to track down the granddaughter of the guy who built it. And she invited me over. She said, I have some stuff you might be interested in. And she opened up these photo albums and it's like, oh my goodness, here's the lobby in 1935, which I recognized from 1976 as being worn and not as gorgeous. Here's what was called the club room, which was a room off to the side of the lobby, which they rented out for bridge club events and other events, which eventually was separated from the building and became a hairstyling salon. There was a candy store, a small candy store that was attached on the other side of the lobby. And then in the 50s, that was separated from the building and became a small library, and the candy counters moved. I mean, she had all this stuff. And that was a lot of what drove the book was, what do I have? Because I'm not just going to write pages and pages of stuff. I want to write some stuff and have some visuals. I wanted a book that was as much text as visual, or maybe more visual than text.
Yeah, well, it's a very elaborate and I would imagine difficult layout. The positioning of the photographs, how many photographs can you reasonably include on a page? Where do you put the explanatory text in relation to it?
Mm-hmm.
Did you do that yourself? Did you get help with that?
Not.
How did that work?
I did not. I was very lucky. Back when I was first becoming a self-published author, I had 4 or 5 books done that I was with a small publisher and it wasn't working out. And I bought back the rights. And I found a company called Design for Writers in the UK that had on their website, they had done all kinds of book covers. And there was a wide swath of visual looks to them. And I looked at other designers, and other designers kind of had the same book in different, it was the same thing over and over, just different titles. But these people really had a wide ability to take the book and make a thing. And so they did the covers for all my Eli Marks books. And they had the advantage of having 5 books that were done so they could, establish a look for the whole series. And they've been great to work with, and they've done just about every cover for all the books since then. So I just emailed them and said, this is what I'm doing. I know you do interior design. Do you guys want to do this? It's going to be a bear of a project. And they said, yep, we want to do this. So it was fairly simple. I gave them all the text, and within the text I'd placed, here's where this photo goes, here's where this photo goes. And every photo had a unique number to it so they could easily find where it would go. And they ran some tests for me. Do you want to do this? Is this how you want the pages to look? Is this how you want to do captions? And once we landed in that, then Rebecca, who did the actual interior design, went off and did the book. I mean, it was amazing. It's like, oh, I thought we were going to do this chapter by chapter. She said, no, let's just do it. And then she'd send me a PDF and I go through, and the changes I made were things she wouldn't know. Like I would say, on this 2-page spread, you have this picture of the director and an actress from Harold and Maude walking by a pool, kind of small. And over here you have a big version of Ruth and Bud and a policeman from Harold and Maude. That's a really well-known picture. You can make that smaller. The picture by the pool is very rare. I'd never seen it before. So let's make that bigger. And that's really what it came down to was I didn't want to, she'd done a great job of laying it out. I didn't want to change the pagination, but I would just make things bigger or smaller, or maybe swap out a photo and add a photo. But it was given that it's 160 pages long and every page is designed, it was a very, very simple process.
Wow, that's great to hear and very surprising.
Well, she's a really good designer.
Yeah.
And that helped.
Well, I'm trying to think of a discreet way of asking this question, but if someone, so it sounds like you were doing this, as a labor of love.
Yep.
And acknowledging that maybe this would only be fascinating to 3 people, although it sounds like based on your Kickstarter experience, you're finding that there's a wider audience. But I can imagine that a design process like that could be very expensive and would be. Really?
It
no
wasn't.
Kidding.
With the cover and everything, under $2,000. I was amazed.
I'm amazed also because it is it would be a very complicated design process.
Yeah, I'd hate to think they did it just because they loved this. They were very enraptured with the idea of it. It's something they hadn't done anything like that. I don't know if they'd done a full color 160 page, every page designed thing before. They've done tons and tons of books, but I think they were more normal books. And this was a fun challenge for them.
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to speculate about whether this is the case in your case or not, but I can imagine that people who might be thinking that something like that is out of reach for them, first of all, it's worth asking. But second of all, it's worth asking, around, because I think an analogous situation might be with audiobooks. Audiobooks, you can spend as much as you want to
Right.
have an audiobook narrated, but if you find someone who's starting out and they're looking to build their portfolio, then oftentimes, you can find deals. So, people shouldn't stop themselves from pursuing something just on the assumption that it's going to be too expensive for them to do.
Well, I knew, unlike any other book I'd done, I mean, you know what it's like. You write the book, you pay to have someone edit it, you get the cover done, you're a few $100 in, and then you publish the book. I knew this was going to be expensive, so I gave myself a budget. I said, I'm going to spend $5,000 on the book. I may never see that money again. That's fine. This is a book of a lifetime. This is something I've learned over the last 50 years how to do, and now I'm able to do it because I know all the pieces now. And the design was much less expensive than I thought. Getting the rights to the photos was the other $3,000. And the best thing I did was at the beginning of the process, I got on the phone with a copyright attorney and said, here's what I'm doing. What are my pitfalls? What do I need to worry about? Because there's photos in the book that are everywhere online, but somebody owns them probably. And her advice was, I just think it was great advice. She said, anything that you can license it. If somebody is licensing the photo, if someone is proclaiming they have the rights to it, get it from them. And those photo costs ranged from $39 a piece to $100 a piece. So I didn't do a lot of $100 photos. I did a lot of $39 photos. And then she said, if you can't find someone who's licensing the photo, if you transform it, then you're probably pretty safe under fair use. And transforming is as simple as adding a caption to it to explain why you need to have this picture here in this story. And so that took care of all my photo needs. And then the book also has tons and tons of movie ads from actually all the way from the 30s into the 70s. And with that, when I talked to her, I said that the issue here is these are ads from the newspaper. The company that created the ad no longer exists because it was at that time General Cinema. The newspaper in some cases no longer exists. It's just a microfilm somewhere. So I wouldn't know who to get the rights from. And she said, in a case like that, because this is essentially an educational historical book, and these are being used to support your story, you're fine. You're just fine. So that was very, very helpful to realize, particularly that key piece of advice. If someone is licensing the photo, get it from them, and you're making it less likely that you're going to run into issues with it.
I know a nuance of licensing content is that oftentimes licenses can have a limitation, like you can use this up to 1,000 print copies of the book, and then you have to relicense it. Did you face any situations like that?
I did. I think they were saying 1,500 was what I ran into a lot, and I don't think I'm going to have a problem with that. I don't think that's going to be an issue.
That would be a good problem to have.
It'd be a good problem to have. The cheapest photos I got were from the Minnesota Historical Society, which owns all the negatives from the two of the three local newspapers. So all the historical photos that I needed from the 72, 74 era, with a lot of digging, I was able to get those, and those are $25 a piece. You just can't use them on the cover. But what was interesting about that research was, so I know that on March 22, 1974, there's an event at the Westgate Theater with the 2 stars. So I know that's the date. So I know that the photos were shot on that day, but they might not have been printed on that day. So you have to go through and pull everything from that paper for that day and the 2 or 3 days on either side of it and go through. Nothing's really marked. It's just, here's the photographer's stack of negatives. You have to go through all their stuff. And invariably, I found the most common pictures that I had seen everywhere, those strips were gone. they were not there anymore. They would go from photo number 14, 15, 16, and then jump up to photo number 22, 23, 24, 25. So someone had taken them out at some point and never put them back, which was fine. But what that left me was, here are the photos from that event, like the first year anniversary when Ruth Gordon came to town. There were a stack of photos that they never printed. They printed one photo that I recognized, and there were 5 other ones that they'd never printed that they had and were gorgeous and were not the same thing over and over. They're different parts of the theater and Ruth in different places and all that. And when that happens, your eyebrows shoot up. And it's like, oh my goodness, no one has seen this in 50 years. And I get to put it in the book, and it's worth $25 a piece to do that.
Yeah. So I wanted to wrap up by asking about, now that you've completed your book, you've gotten some feedback as a result of a Kickstarter about interest in this. So how are you planning on notifying people about the book? What kind of audiences are you going after? Or, it's unfortunate that you can't have like an event at the theater, which would be super cool. But what are your promotion and marketing plans?
Well, boy, a smarter person would have a really long answer for that. They are a little limited. There is a Harold and Maude group on Facebook that those folks seem very interested in the book. There are several historical Facebook pages about Minneapolis. Those people seem very interested in the book. There are 2 movie theaters in town who are kind of repertory houses, sort of. And both of them have said, yes, when we show Harold and Maude next, we'd love to have you come and sell the book and maybe even talk about the movie beforehand. So I know locally there's a lot of interest, and I will be approaching every one of the local bookstores about it because it is something people still remember as happening here in the Twin Cities 50 years ago. There's still some interest with that. Beyond that, I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure how to get out to the other Harold and Maude fans that aren't on Facebook, but I'll figure that out eventually. Like I say, I'm happy with the book. I don't feel a strong, I don't have to beat on all the doors. If ideas come up to me as how to promote it, then there's a couple film-related podcasts that I'll be talking to. There's a history-related podcast that I'll be talking to. And I'll figure out more.
Yeah, I think that's perfect because, I think the first thwack is it has Harold and Maude in the title and it has the Westgate Theater in the title. So you start with those. But, as you're talking, every time you mention a topic like, this is why this got built in the Depression or whatever it is, like, okay, so find outlets that are interested in that era, like any era in that period would be, you probably have enough interesting information to say, oh, here's a representation, a little sub niche within this larger niche you're interested in. What was going on during World War II on the U.S. home front and things like that. And, you can plumb those topics way beyond the things that might seem obvious at first glance.
Well, and the reason I wanted to talk to you on your podcast was because, like I say, I don't think there's a huge audience for this book. However, it has delighted me for the last year to work on it. And I'm just thrilled with it. And it is, although I didn't know it, it's the book I've always wanted to do. And that's something I want people to hear, that if you've got that thing in you, go ahead and do it. And don't worry about, is it going to make money? I mean, unless you absolutely, you shouldn't sink your life savings into this stuff. But if it's something you really, really are excited by, and if you wake up smiling, going, oh yeah, we're going to do this today, we're going to go into this research thing, whatever, do it. Because why else are we indie writers and publishers unless we can make the books we love? And I just think if you love it, there's going to be an audience for it somewhere. And it's never been easier to do this kind of book. I couldn't have done this 5 years ago, but now, hooked up with these designers in the UK. They're working directly with Book Vault to make sure that, everything is correct on the end papers and the bleeds and all that. You can make beautiful books, and books last a long time. So I don't know what you're waiting for out there. You should go make your beautiful book.
Well, I can't think of a nicer way to end our conversation. I can't think of a better way to say that exact message. So, John, as always, it's lovely chatting with you. And please let everyone know where they can go to find out more about you and your books, and held over Harold and Maude, the Westgate Theater online.
Yes, the book will be available, I think, everywhere in early September. And you can either search for Held Over, Harold and Maude at the Westgate Theater. I think it will only take you to the book, or just go to my publisher website, which is albertsbridgebooks.com. That's albertsbridgebooks.com. And you'll have many options there as to how you want to buy it.
Great. Thank you so much.